Hey guys, tonight we begin with the fascinating world of medieval medicine, a time when physicians spoke Latin confidently, wore dramatic robes, and treated deadly illness with methods that often made things dramatically worse. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. If medieval medicine had a signature move, it was bloodletting. It was their version of, have you tried turning it off and on again? Headache? Remove blood. Fever? Remove blood. Plague? Remove significantly more blood. The entire practice was based on the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to Galen, health was all about balance. If you were sick, one of these invisible fluids had clearly decided to misbehave, and since blood was the only humour you could physically see without inventing a microscope 800 years early, well, blood became the villain. Too much blood? Dangerous. Too little blood? Also dangerous. But if you're not sure, remove some anyway. Doctors used a sharp tool called a lancet to slice open a vein, usually in the arm. Bowls were placed underneath to collect the blood, because nothing says healing like watching your life fluid drain into pottery. There were even detailed charts explaining which vein corresponded to which illness. Medieval physicians loved diagrams. If you're going to be wrong, at least be organized about it. Now here's the awkward part. Most serious diseases already make you weak. High fever, dehydration, organ stress. What your body needs is strength and recovery time. What it got was less oxygen circulating to your brain. Patients often fainted during bloodletting, which was interpreted not as "this seems bad," but as excellent. The excess is leaving the body. During the Black Death, bloodletting was widely used. Imagine surviving swollen lymph nodes the size of eggs, raging fever, and systemic infection, only for your doctor to say, with confidence, "You appear to have too much vitality." And out comes the knife. If you survived, the doctor was brilliant. If you didn't, your humours were clearly beyond saving. Very convenient system. To be fair, medieval doctors weren't villains twirling moustaches. They were operating within the best framework they had. The tragedy wasn't cruelty, it was confidence. For over 1,000 years, bloodletting remained standard treatment across Europe and beyond. Kings did it, monks did it, farmers did it. Everyone lost blood together. Very unifying. Because when your entire medical theory revolves around balance, nothing feels more productive than actively draining something, even if that something is you. Now, if slicing someone's vein open felt a bit aggressive, or if you simply wanted a more organic approach, medieval medicine had a charming alternative. Leeches. Yes, small slimy worms with a strong interest in your bloodstream were considered licensed professionals. The logic was beautifully simple. Leeches attach. Leeches suck blood. Excess blood is removed. Balance restored. Everyone goes home happy, except occasionally the patient. Leeches were applied to everything: fevers, headaches, swollen limbs, toothaches, melancholy. If you walked into a medieval clinic looking slightly uncomfortable, there was a strong chance someone would respond with, "Have you considered worms?" To be fair, leeches do have legitimate medical uses today. In modern microsurgery, they are carefully controlled to improve blood flow in specific cases. But medieval physicians did not have modern surgical precision. They had enthusiasm. Patients would have multiple leeches placed on their skin at once. The creatures would attach, and quietly draw blood for extended periods. Sometimes doctors would let them feed until they naturally detached, and leeches are very patient. The problem wasn't just the blood loss, it was the quantity. Too many leeches, too much time, too little remaining circulation. An already weakened patient could quickly become dangerously anemic. Dizziness, fainting, weakness. All signs that in modern times would suggest perhaps stop. In medieval times, these were interpreted as progress. If the swelling reduced slightly, success. If the fever broke temporarily, success. If the patient collapsed, well, clearly the imbalance was severe, as was. What's remarkable is how normal this became. Barbers often doubled as surgeons and kept jars of leeches ready for use. You could walk in for a haircut and leave slightly lighter, in multiple ways. And there was something comforting about it, in a strange way. The leech was visible. The blood flow was visible. The treatment felt active. Doing something feels better than doing nothing, even if that something is being gently drained by an aquatic parasite. Medieval medicine may not have had antibiotics, but it had worms and confidence. If bloodletting and leeches didn't quite solve your problem, medieval medicine had a stronger option. Mercury. Yes, the shiny liquid metal you were told not to touch as a child was once considered a therapeutic miracle, especially for syphilis. When syphilis spread across Europe in the late 15th century, it terrified physicians. It caused sores, fevers, neurological damage, and eventually death. Doctors needed a solution. They found one: poison. Mercury was applied as ointment, rubbed directly onto the skin. It was inhaled in steam baths. Sometimes it was swallowed in various compounds. The reasoning was simple. Mercury caused sweating and drooling. If you were sweating, toxins must be leaving your body. If you were drooling excessively, that also meant something was happening. And in medieval medicine, something happening was usually interpreted as good. In reality, mercury is a neurotoxin. It damages the brain, kidneys, and nervous system. Long-term exposure leads to tremors, memory loss, tooth decay, and personality changes, which doctors occasionally described as signs the treatment was working. Patients undergoing mercury therapy often lost teeth. Gums would rot. Saliva would pour uncontrollably. Limbs would shake. Skin would blister. But if the syphilis symptoms temporarily lessened, the mercury was credited. If the patient deteriorated rapidly, well, the disease must have been aggressive. There was even a grim saying at the time: a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. Which sounds poetic until you realize the lifetime might not be very long. To be fair, Mercury does kill bacteria in certain contexts. The problem is that it also kills you. It's a bit overachieving in that department, and yet, for centuries, it remained a standard treatment. Why? Because it produced visible reactions. Sweating, salivation, discomfort, all signs that something dramatic was happening inside the body, and drama felt like medicine. In a world without germ theory, visible suffering often looked like progress. The patient endured poisoning in the hope of curing infection. Sometimes they survived. Sometimes the cure finished the job the disease had started. But at least the physician could confidently say, "We tried something powerful. Very powerful. Arguably, too powerful." Now imagine you walk into a medieval clinic with a severe headache. You're dizzy. Your vision blurs. Maybe you've had a seizure. Maybe you're behaving strangely. Today, you might get a scan, some medication, and instructions to rest. In the Middle Ages, you might get a drill. Trepanation, the practice of boring a hole into the skull, is one of the oldest surgical procedures in human history. It predates the medieval period by thousands of years, but it was still very much alive and enthusiastically practiced during the Middle Ages. The reasoning varied. Some believed pressure inside the skull needed release. Others thought evil spirits were trapped inside. Either way, the solution was identical. Make an exit. The procedure involved scraping or cutting through the scalp, then carefully drilling or scraping through the bone of the skull until a hole formed. No modern anesthesia, no sterile environment, just tools, hands, and a firm belief in cosmic balance. To be fair, in rare cases of head trauma where pressure builds up from internal bleeding, relieving that pressure can save a life. Modern neurosurgeons still perform similar procedures in sterile operating rooms with imaging technology and actual anesthesia. Medieval surgeons had optimism. Some skulls discovered by archaeologists show signs of healing around trepanation holes. That means some patients survived long enough for bone to grow back partially, which is impressive and horrifying. Imagine enduring someone drilling into your skull, surviving the infection risk, and then having to explain the scar for the rest of your life. Ah yes, the time they tried to let my demons out. The danger wasn't just the drilling. Infection was almost guaranteed. Without knowledge of bacteria, tools were rarely sterilized. Post-operative care was limited to prayer, bandaging, and hope. But trepanation persisted. Why? Because it was visible action. It was decisive. It felt bold. When medicine doesn't fully understand what's happening inside the body, doing something dramatic feels reassuring, even if that something involves perforating the cranium. Sometimes the patient improved, likely because their condition wasn't severe to begin with. Sometimes they didn't. But medieval doctors could confidently say one thing: at least the demons had a way out. Whether the patient did was less certain. Now, if you were wealthy in the medieval world, you didn't have to settle for leeches and skull drills. No. You could drink gemstones, because nothing says medical advancement like dissolving your jewelry into a beverage. The belief was that precious stones held powerful natural energies. Emeralds were said to cure epilepsy. Sapphires could treat plague. Rubies strengthened the heart. Pearls were good for digestion. And gold, naturally, was good for everything. The process was simple. Grind the gem into a fine powder, mix it into wine or water, and drink it. What could possibly go wrong? Well, for starters, many gemstones are chemically inert, which means you're essentially swallowing decorative sand. Best case scenario, nothing happens. Worst case, you irritate your stomach lining while quietly questioning your life choices. But sometimes the powders weren't pure. Some minerals contained toxic elements like arsenic or lead. Congratulations, your luxury treatment just became a poison cocktail, and it was expensive. Only the rich could afford to grind up their assets in the name of healing. Imagine paying a fortune to ingest pulverized sapphire, only to discover that wealth does not, in fact, make your immune system sparkle. The psychology behind it is fascinating. Expensive things feel powerful. Rare objects feel potent. If diamonds are valuable, surely they must do something impressive inside the body. Spoiler, they do not. At best, you're hydrated and slightly poorer. At worst, you're chemically compromised, but the placebo effect is powerful. If a noble drank crushed pearl dissolved in wine and felt better, the treatment was praised. If he didn't survive, clearly the illness was particularly aggressive. The stone was never at fault. Medieval medicine loved visible action. Grinding, mixing, swallowing something rare. It felt intentional. scientific even. It also reinforced social hierarchy. Peasants got leeches, nobles got gemstone smoothies, different packaging, same risk. In the end, ground gems didn't rebalance humors. They didn't fight infection. They didn't cure plague. But they did prove one timeless truth. If you make something expensive enough, someone will eventually try to drink it. Just when you think medieval medicine has reached peak absurdity, it calmly whispers, "We're not done." Enter mummy powder. Yes, actual mummies. By the late medieval and early modern period, European physicians developed a fascination with a substance called mumia. Originally, the word referred to bitumen, a tar-like material used in ancient embalming. Over time, that definition expanded dramatically. Eventually, people decided that powdered Egyptian mummies themselves had powerful healing properties. So naturally, they started grinding them up and ingesting them. If you had internal bleeding, mummy powder. Bruises, mummy powder. Stomach problems, mummy powder. Because nothing says medical breakthrough like consuming someone who has been dead for 1,000 years. The reasoning was surprisingly consistent with medieval logic. Mummies were preserved. Preservation suggested strength. Therefore, their remains must contain powerful life-sustaining properties, which is a bold interpretation of archaeology. Merchants began importing mummified remains from Egypt to Europe. Apothecaries stocked powdered mummy alongside herbs and spices. Wealthy patients would mix it into drinks or apply it to wounds. Let's pause and appreciate what this means. At some point, someone looked at a preserved ancient body and thought, "Yes, I will eat that." The results were not miraculous. Powdered human remains do not cure internal hemorrhaging. They do not fight infection. They do not rebalance humors. They do, however, introduce bacteria and contaminants into your system. There was also the minor issue of authenticity. As demand increased, actual mummies became scarce. So some merchants allegedly substituted recently deceased criminals or fabricated mixtures, which means you might not even have been consuming authentic ancient royalty, just moderately fresh mystery meat. Medieval medicine loved symbolism. The idea of absorbing strength from preserved bodies felt powerful. It was dramatic, exotic, slightly horrifying. But like many treatments of the time, it was based more on imagination than evidence. And yet, for centuries, this practice persisted. Because when medicine doesn't fully understand disease, it often turns to myth. And sometimes myth tastes like dust. Very expensive dust. Now we arrive at one of medieval medicine's more personal solutions: urine. To be fair, medieval physicians were not entirely irrational when it came to bodily fluids. They practiced something called uroscopy, the careful examination of urine to diagnose disease. Doctors would inspect color, smell, even consistency. There were charts. There were glass flasks. It was practically performance art. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Observing urine can actually reveal useful medical information. Even today, doctors test it. The problem is what happened next. Sometimes, urine didn't just diagnose illness. It treated it. In certain traditions, patients were encouraged to drink their own urine to rebalance internal humors. The logic? It came from your body. Therefore, it must contain something you're lacking. If something is out of balance, perhaps recycling it would restore harmony. It's almost sustainable. Urine was also applied topically to wounds and skin conditions. Because if the body produced it, surely it must be medicinal. Except urine contains waste products your body is actively trying to eliminate. Reintroducing them tends to defeat the purpose. In an age without germ theory, the distinction between waste and medicine wasn't entirely clear. Bodily fluids were mysterious, symbolic. connected to identity. If blood could be drained and mucus categorized, why not reuse what exits the system? And yet, like many medieval treatments, urine therapy relied heavily on interpretation. If the patient improved, the treatment was praised. If the patient worsened, clearly the imbalance was deeper than expected. There's a certain logic loop here that's almost impressive. Medieval medicine often operated on analogy rather than biology. Warm things treated cold illnesses. Wet things balanced dryness. And fluids that came from you must be helpful to you. But waste is waste for a reason. Drinking it doesn't restore balance. It restores confusion. Still, in a world without antibiotics, sterile bandages, or laboratory tests, people reached for what was available. And what was available was themselves. If nothing else, medieval medicine was resourceful. Deeply, disturbingly resourceful. And occasionally circular. Very circular. Now we enter the truly creative section of medieval medicine. Imagine you have the plague. Your lymph nodes are swollen into painful, egg-sized lumps called buboes. You have a raging fever. You feel like death is rehearsing. The physician arrives. He studies you carefully. And then he brings a chicken, a live one. The treatment went something like this. Cut the chicken open, sometimes while it was still alive, and press the warm, exposed flesh directly against the patient's swollen bubo. The idea was that the infection would transfer from the human into the chicken. Yes, the plague would politely relocate. This was based on the concept of transference, the belief that disease could be drawn out or moved from one body into another. It sounds almost logical if you squint hard enough and ignore biology entirely. If bad humours could be drained with blood, perhaps they could also be absorbed by poultry. The chicken, unfortunately, had not agreed to this arrangement. There was no evidence that the disease transferred. There was plenty of evidence that now you had an open wound exposed to raw animal tissue in a pre-antibiotic era, which is not ideal. In fact, it's impressively dangerous. You're already battling Yersinia pestis, a bacterium that does not appreciate jokes. Now you're introducing additional bacteria from a freshly opened bird. It's like trying to fix a house fire by pouring cooking oil on it. But the ritual had emotional power. It felt active. It felt sacrificial. The patient could see something happening. The warmth of the chicken, the physical contact. It created the illusion that the illness was being pulled out. And illusion was often enough to sustain belief. If the patient died, the plague was too strong. If the patient survived, which sometimes happened naturally, the chicken got credit. Medieval medicine thrived on symbolism. Disease was something that invaded the body. Therefore, it could be removed, absorbed, or transferred. Except bacteria do not negotiate with poultry. The plague chicken did not cure the Black Death. It simply added one more confused animal to the situation, and possibly made things worse. But at least the doctor could say with confidence, "We tried everything, including dinner." If the plague chicken didn't solve your problem, medieval medicine had another bold idea. Animal dung. Yes. Because when you look at an open wound, what you really think is missing is manure. Different types of dung were prescribed for different problems. Cow dung for inflammation, dog dung for throat infections, pigeon droppings for baldness. There was a certain agricultural logic to it. Animals were part of daily life, and their byproducts were considered natural substances. Natural meant safe, which is adorable. Dung was applied directly to wounds, mixed into poultices, or sometimes even ingested in small amounts. The idea was that it could draw out infection, cool inflammation, or rebalance humours. In reality, animal feces contain bacteria. Lots of bacteria. The medieval world did not yet understand microbes. So when wounds worsened after treatment, it wasn't seen as contamination. It was seen as the illness working itself out, which is one way to describe sepsis. If a cut became red, swollen, and filled with pus after being coated in manure, that was interpreted as the body fighting back. The body was fighting back, just not in the way they thought. The most dangerous part of dung therapy wasn't stupidity, it was familiarity. People lived around animals constantly. Manure was common. It didn't feel exotic or dangerous. It felt accessible. And medieval medicine often equated accessibility with utility. To be fair, there are rare cases where certain natural substances contain compounds with mild antibacterial properties. But those are specific plants and minerals, not the digestive leftovers of a farm animal. Applying dung to a wound is essentially giving bacteria VIP access. It's like inviting more enemies into a battle and hoping they switch sides. Still, the treatment persisted for centuries. It was cheap, it was available, and sometimes wounds heal on their own despite intervention, which gave the illusion of success. If you survived, the dung worked. If you didn't, the infection was simply too powerful. Medieval medicine had a consistent pattern. Visible action equals progress, even when that action involves spreading fecal matter on a vulnerable part of your body. Some cures were questionable. This one was aromatic, and not in a good way. If medieval doctors couldn't find the problem in your blood, your bile, or your barnyard, there was always one final suspect: the sky. Because clearly your illness might not be bacterial, it might be planetary. Astrology played a significant role in medieval medicine. Physicians were often trained to read star charts alongside anatomy texts. Before performing procedures, especially bloodletting, they would consult the positions of the moon and planets. You didn't just have a fever, you had a fever under an unfortunate alignment of Mars. Each zodiac sign was believed to govern a specific part of the body. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms. If the moon was passing through a certain sign, operating on that body part was considered dangerous. So if you had a severe head injury but the moon was in Aries, sorry, we wait. Because nothing stabilizes internal bleeding like cosmic patience. Doctors would sometimes delay procedures until the stars were favorable. They believed celestial bodies influenced bodily humors, tides, emotions, and overall health. And to be fair, the moon does influence tides. Unfortunately, it does not care about your rash. Astrological medicine created a fascinating blend of confidence and caution. On one hand, physicians felt guided by divine cosmic order. On the other, they were essentially scheduling surgeries around horoscope compatibility. Good news, your infection is treatable. Bad news, Venus is in retrograde. It sounds absurd now, but in a pre-scientific world, astrology provided structure. It offered explanation. It made the universe feel orderly. Illness wasn't random. It was aligned, and alignment could be corrected. The danger came when urgent medical needs were delayed because Jupiter was feeling dramatic, or when treatments were performed solely because the stars suggested it was an auspicious day. In some cases, patients likely died not from the treatment itself, but from waiting for the cosmos to approve it. Medieval medicine deeply respected patterns. Unfortunately, they were looking in the wrong direction. The sky may be beautiful, but it has never prescribed antibiotics, and it has absolutely no opinion about your spleen. Still, for centuries, doctors trusted it, because when science is limited, symbolism fills the gap. even if that symbolism is millions of miles away. Now, if Mercury wasn't bold enough for you, medieval medicine had another exciting option: arsenic. Yes. The same substance later famous for discreetly removing inconvenient relatives was, at one point, considered therapeutic. The logic behind arsenic treatment was surprisingly straightforward. In small doses, it seemed to stimulate the body. It caused visible reactions: warmth, sweating, sometimes mild euphoria. Therefore, it must be doing something helpful. And as we've seen, medieval medicine loved when something was clearly happening. Arsenic was prescribed for a variety of conditions: skin diseases, ulcers, fevers, even as a general tonic to strengthen the body. Because nothing strengthens you quite like controlled poisoning. The key word here is controlled. Unfortunately, medieval dosage precision was not what we would call refined. Too little, and the doctor assumed the patient needed more. Too much, and the patient experienced vomiting, abdominal pain, organ damage, or sudden death. But in small doses, very small doses, arsenic can produce temporary stimulation. It can make someone feel slightly more alert or energetic, which probably convinced many physicians they were onto something. It's the same principle as giving someone a small electrical shock and declaring them revitalized. Arsenic accumulates in the body. Over time, repeated exposure damages organs and weakens the immune system. Skin lesions develop, hair may fall out, neurological problems emerge. But because these symptoms developed gradually, they were rarely blamed on the medicine. They were blamed on the illness. The pattern should feel familiar by now. If the patient improved, success. If the patient declined, the disease was aggressive. The cure was never questioned. What makes arsenic especially ironic is that it later became a notorious murder weapon. By the early modern period, people knew it could quietly and effectively end a life. Which raises an uncomfortable thought. Medieval physicians were prescribing something that assassins would later use deliberately. Except here, it was done with full medical confidence. No dark cloak required, just a reassuring tone and a small measured dose of death. Sometimes the line between medicine and poison was thin, and medieval doctors walked it boldly. Very boldly. If poison felt too subtle and drilling too aggressive, medieval medicine had a more straightforward approach. Heat, specifically, lock the patient in a hot room and sweat the illness out. Sweat baths were commonly prescribed for fevers, infections, and various mysterious internal imbalances. The theory was simple. Disease was caused by bad humors or toxins. Heat opens the pores. Sweat expels toxins. Therefore, the hotter the better. Patients were placed in heated chambers, wrapped in blankets, or positioned near intense fires. Sometimes herbal steam was added for extra therapeutic ambience. You weren't just overheating, you were aromatically overheating. The problem? Many serious illnesses already involve high fever, which means your body is already overheating. So the medieval solution was essentially, let's help it along. Imagine someone dehydrated from infection, already sweating uncontrollably, and then placing them in a sealed, hot environment to accelerate fluid loss. What could go wrong? Well, dehydration, fainting, organ stress, and in severe cases, heat stroke. But if the patient emerged drenched in sweat, exhausted but alive, the treatment was considered successful. Look at all that toxin leaving the body. If the patient collapsed, the fever must have been too powerful. Again, the pattern repeats. Sweat baths weren't entirely irrational. We know today that heat can sometimes help with muscle tension in certain minor conditions. Saunas can be relaxing. Controlled, moderate heat has benefits. The medieval version was less wellness retreat and more accidental slow roasting. It was dramatic. It was visible. It felt active. The physician could point to the soaked sheets and say, "There, the illness is leaving." What was actually leaving was water. Lots of it. In an era without intravenous fluids or electrolyte replacement, dehydration could become deadly very quickly. But the logic was consistent with the world view of the time. Disease was something foreign inside you, something unwanted, something that needed to be expelled. And if sweating felt like expulsion, it must be working. Even if the only thing being expelled was your remaining strength. Medieval medicine believed deeply in visible effort, even if that effort involved turning the patient into a human dumpling, steamed, not cured. Now, if you were lucky enough not to be bleeding, sweating, drilled, poisoned, or marinated in poultry, medieval medicine still had one more subtle option: lead. Lead was everywhere in the medieval world. It was easy to work with, widely available, and, most importantly, made skin look beautifully pale. Pale skin signaled wealth. It meant you weren't laboring in the sun. So cosmetic mixtures containing white lead became extremely popular, especially among nobility. And because medieval medicine had no firm boundary between cosmetics and treatment, lead-based ointments were also used medicinally. Skin condition? Lead paste. Sores? Lead ointment. Want to look healthier? Lead powder. White lead gave the face a smooth porcelain glow. It covered blemishes. It created the illusion of perfect health, which is ironic because prolonged use caused the exact opposite. Lead is toxic, slowly, quietly toxic. It accumulates in the body over time. It damages the nervous system, kidneys, and digestive tract. Symptoms include abdominal pain, fatigue, irritability, tremors, and eventually organ failure. But the effects are gradual, which meant they were rarely linked to the makeup itself. If someone grew weaker over time, it was probably their humours again, or age, or fate, not the daily application of poison to the face. Some medieval ointments combined lead with vinegar to enhance absorption, which meant it didn't just sit on the skin. It entered the body more effectively. Efficient. There's something darkly fascinating about this one. Unlike bloodletting or trepanation, lead cosmetics didn't look dramatic. There was no visible violence, no drilling, no bleeding, just beauty. Beauty that slowly dismantled the body from the inside. And because it made people look healthier in the short term, it reinforced its own success. A pale, smooth complexion was considered attractive and refined. Never mind the headaches. Never mind the organ damage. At least you looked elegant. It's a reminder that medieval medicine didn't always harm through aggressive intervention. Sometimes it harmed through vanity, through fashion, through the quiet belief that appearance equals health. Lead didn't cure disease. It disguised it. And then, patiently, it joined it. By now, we've drained blood, swallowed poison, drilled skulls, and applied manure. But sometimes medieval medicine decided the problem wasn't physical at all. It was spiritual. During outbreaks like the Black Death, many people believed disease was divine punishment. God was angry. Society had sinned. And the plague was a cosmic correction. Naturally, the medical response was to whip yourself. Flagellant movements spread across parts of Europe during times of crisis. Groups of men would travel from town to town, publicly whipping themselves as an act of penance. The belief was that if they suffered voluntarily, God might spare them, or at least reduce the plague's impact. On paper, It sounds dramatic but symbolic. In practice, it involved repeated open wounds in crowded, unsanitary conditions during a pandemic, which is not ideal. Imagine hundreds of people gathering, chanting, bleeding, and striking their own backs with metal-tipped whips, all while a highly contagious disease spreads nearby. From a medical standpoint, this is less cure and more group infection event. Open wounds increase vulnerability to bacteria. Physical exhaustion weakens the immune system. Large gatherings increase transmission. It's like combining stress, blood loss, and social proximity into one coordinated strategy. But from their perspective, it made sense. If the illness came from divine wrath, medical herbs wouldn't solve it. Repentance would. And in a world without germ theory, invisible punishment was just as plausible as invisible bacteria. Flagellation gave people something powerful, agency. Instead of feeling helpless against plague, they could act. They could demonstrate devotion. They could show God they were serious. The tragedy is that the action likely made things worse. Some flagellant groups were eventually banned by authorities, partly because they caused unrest, and partly because they didn't seem to be stopping the plague. Shocking. This cure wasn't about humours or toxins. It was about fear searching for control. And when science can't explain disaster, symbolism fills the gap. Unfortunately, symbolism doesn't disinfect wounds, but it does make for very intense public gatherings, and medieval medicine, as we've learned, rarely lacked intensity. After all the blood, poison, drilling, sweating, and symbolic self-whipping, we arrive at the final and most dangerous medieval cure of all. Certainty. Not a herb, not a mineral, not a chicken. Conviction. Medieval physicians were not fools. Many were highly educated for their time. They studied classical texts, memorized Galen and Hippocrates, trained for years, and sincerely believed they understood the human body. The problem was not ignorance alone. It was the refusal to question inherited theory. If Galen said illness came from humoral imbalance, then illness came from humoral imbalance. If Aristotle described nature in a certain way, that description became intellectual law. Observation rarely overruled authority, and when treatments failed, repeatedly, the framework stayed intact. If bloodletting didn't work, the imbalance was too severe. If mercury killed the patient, the disease was aggressive. If drilling the skull failed, the demons were stubborn. The theory survived. The patient did not. This is what made medieval medicine so resilient and so dangerous. It had internal logic. It had structure. It had centuries of respected scholars defending it. It also lacked experimental testing. There were no controlled trials, no sterile labs, no peer review in the modern sense. Treatments were validated by tradition and anecdote. If someone survived after a procedure, the procedure was praised. If they died, the illness was blamed. Confirmation bias existed long before it had a name, and this confidence delayed progress. For hundreds of years, Europe clung to humoral theory because it felt complete. It explained everything, even when it explained nothing. It wasn't cruelty. It was intellectual rigidity. The true breakthrough in medicine didn't come from adding more dramatic treatments. It came from questioning the entire system, from asking, what if we're wrong? That question changed everything. But until then, patients trusted doctors who trusted ancient texts more than their own results. And that is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. The medieval doctor didn't doubt himself. He doubted your humours. In the end, the worst cure wasn't leeches or mercury. It was certainty without evidence. Because once you are absolutely sure you're right, you stop noticing the bodies. On the night of April 14th, 1912, the first-class dining saloon of the RMS Titanic shimmered like a royal banquet hall drifting across black water. Electric chandeliers cast a steady golden glow over carved oak paneling and gleaming white tablecloths. Outside, the Atlantic was cold and moonless. Inside, it was velvet, crystal, and confidence. The Titanic was the crown jewel of the White Star Line, advertised as the safest and most luxurious ship ever built, and the dining room was its stage. Here, fortunes gathered in tailored evening coats and silk gowns. Millionaires adjusted cufflinks. Heiresses laughed behind gloved hands. Silverware lay arranged in disciplined ranks beside each plate, silently promising that this would not be a simple dinner. It would be an experience. Stewards moved with quiet precision, gliding between tables as if choreographed. Plates arrived not hurriedly but ceremoniously. Every dish was presented with the subtle confidence of a five-star hotel. Except this hotel floated thousands of miles from land. And then there was the menu. 11 courses. 11. Not because anyone was hungry. Hunger was not the point. Display was the point. Refinement. Status. The ability to taste the world without leaving your chair. Oysters harvested from cold waters. Clear consommé named Olga, delicate and perfumed. Salmon draped in mousseline sauce. Filet mignon lily. Roast duckling. And later, sweet indulgences that would end the evening in sugared elegance. This was Edwardian excess at full sail. All guests dined without hurry. Why would they rush? The ship was unsinkable, the journey smooth, the orchestra played softly nearby. Conversations drifted between politics, art, business ventures, and transatlantic ambitions. No one in this room imagined that in a few short hours the same corridors echoing with laughter would fill with something far colder. For now, though, none of that existed. There was only the gentle hum of electricity, the clink of crystal, and the quiet certainty that this glittering, floating palace represented the very height of modern civilization. Dinner had begun, and disaster was already waiting in the dark. The first course arrived with quiet elegance. Oysters. Fresh, glistening, resting on crushed ice as if they had been plucked from the sea moments earlier. A delicate beginning, refined, understated. The kind of opener that whispered wealth rather than shouted it. In Edwardian high society, oysters were more than seafood. They were a signal, a nod to cosmopolitan taste, to global supply chains that stretched from American coasts to British dining tables, to the idea that the modern world had conquered distance itself. If you could enjoy raw oysters in the middle of the Atlantic, what could possibly threaten you? Each shell was presented with precision. A wedge of lemon, perhaps a light mignonette sauce. No heavy seasoning, that would be vulgar. The point was freshness, purity, control. Guests leaned forward, lifting the shells with practiced ease. Conversations continued between bites. Business deals discussed casually. Travel plans to New York outlined with confident certainty. There was no rush, no anxiety, only the comfortable rhythm of the elite at leisure. The irony was almost theatrical. Outside the ship, the Atlantic was brutally cold, the same ocean that had supplied these oysters. The water temperature hovered near freezing. It did not care about crystal glasses or social rank. It did not recognize titles, fortunes, or pedigrees. But inside the dining saloon, none of that mattered. The oysters were consumed in silence or with polite approval. They were a prelude, not the main event. The opening note in a symphony of indulgence. 11 courses meant pacing. It meant appetite management. One did not devour, one sampled. Servants cleared the shells discreetly. Plates disappeared as if by magic. A new set of silverware subtly replaced the old. The machinery of luxury functioned flawlessly. What made the moment extraordinary was not the food itself. Oysters were hardly rare for the wealthy. It was the setting, a palace afloat, technology at its peak, confidence at its highest point. And confidence, history has shown, is often loudest just before it breaks. The oysters were light, clean, almost fragile. A small, elegant taste of the sea. The same sea that, before the night ended, would demand everything back. After the oysters came something warmer, comforting, reassuring. Consommé Olga, a clear amber broth served steaming hot in delicate porcelain bowls, its surface shimmering beneath the chandeliers. Unlike heavy stews or rustic soups, a consommé was a display of culinary discipline. It had to be perfectly clarified. No cloudiness, no excess fat, no chaos. Just pure, refined essence. It was, in many ways, the culinary equivalent of the Titanic itself. Clear, controlled, engineered to perfection. Consommé. Olga was typically made from rich veal stock, infused with subtle aromatics, and finished with a garnish, often thin slices of scallop or delicate herbs floating like ornaments in liquid gold. It was not meant to fill you. It was meant to impress you. Guests lifted their spoons with quiet grace. The warmth spread gently through silk-lined stomachs. A soothing pause between the briny sharpness of oysters and the richer courses yet to come. Outside, the temperature hovered near freezing. Inside, the broth created a brief illusion that the world was perfectly balanced. The orchestra played softly in the background, light waltzes drifting through the hall. Conversations grew livelier. Laughter rose from one table, then another. The air felt thick with satisfaction. In hindsight, the symbolism is almost too perfect. Here was a ship celebrated as the triumph of modern engineering, serving a soup celebrated for its flawless clarity. Both required immense precision. Both relied on systems functioning exactly as intended. And both, ultimately, depended on something far less controllable: nature. The broth was delicate, almost transparent, but beneath its elegance lay hours of preparation, careful skimming, constant attention. One mistake, and the entire pot would cloud. The same was true for the voyage. The diners did not think about ice. They did not think about steel plates or rivets or lookout posts. They thought about the next course, about New York, about opportunity. Consommé Olga was consumed calmly, spoon by spoon. The bowls were cleared. The warmth lingered only briefly before fading. Soon, richer dishes would arrive. But for a moment, a brief, golden moment, everything felt clear, orderly, and perfectly under control. And nothing, absolutely nothing, seemed capable of going wrong. The third course brought something richer, something undeniably proud. Salmon with mousseline sauce. The fish arrived perfectly poached, its pale pink flesh firm yet delicate, resting neatly on porcelain as if it had been positioned by an architect rather than a chef. Draped over it was mousseline, a silken, airy sauce built from hollandaise and whipped cream, light in texture, but unapologetically indulgent. This was not survival food. This was imperial food. Salmon itself was a statement, sourced from cold northern waters, transported with care, preserved with precision. It represented the reach of the modern world. The Edwardian elite did not simply eat, they consumed proof of global dominance. Oceans, trade routes, refrigeration technology. All of it converged on a single plate. Guests cut into the fish with polished silver knives, steam rising gently as flakes separated cleanly. The mousseline melted on the tongue, buttery, luxurious, soft as velvet. Paired with a fine white wine, it was elegance made edible. Around the room, conversations deepened. Some spoke of American investments. Others debated politics back in London. The mood was confident, almost triumphant. After all, they were sailing aboard the largest moving object ever constructed by human hands. Technology had conquered distance. Engineering had conquered the sea. Or so it seemed. The irony of serving a dish so dependent on the sea, so proud of maritime abundance, while gliding through dark, ice-laced waters, is almost cinematic. Salmon symbolized mastery over nature. It suggested that oceans were merely suppliers now, domesticated highways for luxury. Yet outside the hull, the Atlantic remained ancient and indifferent. The mousseline sauce, so carefully whipped to achieve airy perfection, required balance. Too much heat, and it would split. Too little attention, and it would collapse. Its beauty was fragile. The same could be said for the voyage. But fragility was invisible in the dining room. All that mattered was refinement, presentation. The quiet assurance that one belonged among those who dined this way. The plates were cleared, napkins dabbed politely at lips, wine glasses refilled. The meal was building, course by course, toward opulence. And still, the night remained calm. The engines hummed steadily beneath polished floors. The sea, for now, kept its silence. By the time the fourth major course arrived, the evening had shifted from elegance to full declaration. Filet mignon Lily. The name alone suggested refinement, a French flourish meant to elevate an already luxurious cut of beef into something aristocratic. Thick medallions of tenderloin were seared to perfection, their surfaces caramelized, their interiors blushing pink. Around them, a carefully composed garnish of artichoke hearts and truffle slices completed the arrangement. This was no humble steak. Tenderloin was the most prized portion of the animal, lean, soft, and scarce. To serve it mid-ocean was to announce that scarcity did not apply here, that even in the middle of the Atlantic, luxury could be summoned at will. The truffles added another layer of quiet extravagance. Harvested from European soil by trained dogs or pigs, truffles were the culinary equivalent of gold dust. Earthy, aromatic, slightly mysterious. Their presence signaled not just wealth, but taste. Knives sliced cleanly through the meat. A faint hiss of juices met porcelain. The room was alive with subdued pleasure. This was the kind of course that required appreciation. A pause, a small nod of approval. Wine glasses, likely filled with rich Bordeaux, complemented the beef, deepening the experience. Conversation grew warmer, more animated. Shoulders relaxed. Laughter lingered longer. There is something profoundly symbolic about filet mignon being served aboard a ship deemed unsinkable. It represented confidence without restraint, a belief that comfort was permanent, that progress had eliminated risk. Steel hulls, watertight compartments, telegraphs. The modern world had insulated its elite from danger. So why not dine like royalty while crossing a cold, unpredictable ocean? Yet filet mignon, for all its tenderness, is also delicate. Overcook it by a minute, and it loses what makes it special. Precision defines it. Timing defines it. The same was true of the voyage. Below deck, engineers monitored boilers and engines with unwavering focus. Above deck, first-class guests savoured truffles and rare beef. Two worlds, separated by flaws and privilege, connected by machinery and assumption. The plates were cleared once more, another course conquered, another display of abundance achieved. Outside, the Atlantic remained dark. Inside, indulgence reached its peak, and somewhere ahead, unseen in the night, ice waited, indifferent to French sauces and flawless tenderloin. After beef and truffles came something richer, darker, almost ceremonial: roast duckling. By now, the meal had moved beyond hunger entirely. This was about ritual, about pacing the evening like a carefully written symphony, each course building not toward fullness, but toward refinement. The duckling arrived beautifully browned, its skin lacquered and crisp beneath the dining room lights. Inside, the meat was tender and aromatic, likely paired with a subtle sauce, perhaps apple or orange, and accompanied by seasonal vegetables arranged with geometric care. Roast duck was not casual fare. It required preparation, patience, and skill. The skin had to render properly. The flesh had to remain moist. A mistake would be obvious. But in first class that night, mistakes were invisible. Guests leaned in again, knives gliding through crisp skin with a satisfying resistance. The flavors were deeper now, earthier, warmer, a contrast to the earlier delicacy of fish and consommé. The progression was intentional, light to rich, subtle to indulgent. The dining room hummed with contentment. Servants moved like shadows between tables, replacing plates with quiet efficiency. Champagne corks released soft sighs in the distance. The orchestra continued its gentle soundtrack, a civilized lullaby beneath the luxury. By this stage of the dinner, the mood was almost triumphant. 11 courses required stamina, and finishing them required a certain commitment to pleasure. It was an endurance event disguised as elegance. What makes roast duckling especially striking in hindsight is its symbolism. It is a dish associated with celebration, banquets, holidays, royal gatherings. To serve it mid-voyage was to suggest that this crossing itself was a celebration, a triumph of engineering, a social event worthy of feasting. And yet, beneath the polished floors, the engines worked relentlessly. Coal was shoveled into furnaces, steel plates sliced through freezing waters. The ship pressed forward at impressive speed, eager to arrive ahead of schedule. Speed, like luxury, can create a dangerous kind of confidence. But in the dining saloon, none of that tension was visible. There was only warmth, polished silver, and the comforting crackle of roasted skin. The duck was savoured. Bones discreetly removed. Plates cleared once again. The meal marched on. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. Inside, the illusion of control remained perfectly intact. By the time the heavier meats had been cleared, the dinner had entered its most dangerous phase: comfort. Glasses of champagne shimmered under the electric lights. Fine wines, reds deep as garnets, whites pale as morning frost, had been poured steadily between courses. The air in the first-class dining saloon felt thick now, not with smoke or noise, but with satisfaction. This was the hour when conversation bloomed. Men leaned back slightly in their chairs, waistcoats relaxed just enough to signal ease without sacrificing dignity. Women adjusted silk gloves and shared amused observations about fellow passengers. There were discussions of Wall Street investments, English estates, American railroads, Parisian fashions. The ocean at this point might as well not have existed. That was the true luxury aboard the Titanic. Not just food or silverware, but the ability to forget. Forget the darkness outside the windows. Forget the miles of freezing water pressing against steel hull plates. forget that nature had not signed any agreement promising cooperation. Champagne has a way of amplifying certainty. Each delicate bubble seemed to confirm that the voyage was proceeding flawlessly. The ship was smooth, the engines steady, the night calm. The Titanic, marvel of modern engineering, had reduced the Atlantic to a mere inconvenience. Stewards moved in quiet loops, refilling glasses without being asked. Bread baskets reappeared. A final glance at the printed menu might have sparked mild astonishment. There were still courses left. Still more. That was the nature of Edwardian excess. Abundance layered upon abundance until the extraordinary began to feel routine. 11 courses were not necessary. They were theatrical. A declaration that scarcity did not apply here. Yet beneath the chandeliers, time was passing. Up on the bridge, officers monitored the horizon. The temperature had dropped sharply. The sea was eerily calm, almost too calm. No waves broke against potential ice. No whitecaps to warn the eye. Inside, laughter rose from one table, then another. Someone proposed a toast. Crystal touched crystal. A bright, fragile sound. For a fleeting moment, it must have felt as though nothing could disturb this floating palace of certainty. Not the cold, not the distance, not even the sea itself. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, silent and immovable, ice drifted closer. By the time dessert approached, the evening had softened into something almost dreamlike. Waldorf pudding, a dish that carried with it the glamour of New York's famed Waldorf Astoria Hotel, a name synonymous with wealth, innovation, and polished American sophistication. To serve it aboard the Titanic was more than culinary choice. It was symbolism, a floating connection between old-world aristocracy and new-world ambition. The pudding itself was rich and ornate, a steamed confection often filled with apples, nuts, perhaps dried fruit, bound together in a warm, dense sweetness. It would have been served with a sauce, likely vanilla or wine-based, poured gently over the top so it glistened under the chandeliers. This was comfort elevated to art. Guests, already deep into indulgence, welcomed the sweetness. After oysters, consommé, salmon, beef, duck, and wine, dessert did not satisfy hunger. It completed a ritual. It sealed the experience with sugar and warmth. Forks pressed softly into the pudding. Steam rose faintly. The sauce pooled like liquid silk across porcelain plates. It was the kind of dessert that encouraged lingering. No one rushed pudding. Around the room, the mood had reached its calmest, most assured point. The difficult work of dining, of navigating 11 courses without appearing greedy or fatigued, was nearly complete. Pride mingled with pleasure. One had endured extravagance and emerged triumphant. Outside, however, the night had grown sharper. The temperature had dropped further. The Atlantic lay unnaturally flat, like polished obsidian. To the trained eye, this stillness was not comforting. It was dangerous. Without waves breaking against ice, detection became far more difficult. But in the dining saloon, that knowledge had no place. Waldorf pudding represented transatlantic optimism, the blending of cultures, wealth crossing oceans, modernity connecting continents. The Titanic herself embodied that same ideal. Progress, confidence, mastery. Dessert was finished slowly, napkins folded, coffee and liqueurs prepared to follow. The orchestra continued its gentle strains, perhaps unaware that time had thinned. The sweetness lingered. Sugared certainty hung in the air. And somewhere above, in the freezing darkness, a lookout strained his eyes toward a horizon that refused to reveal what lay directly ahead. With dessert cleared and Waldorf pudding reduced to sweet memory, the final ritual began. Coffee, dark, aromatic, poured into fine china cups that seemed almost too delicate to hold something so bold. Alongside it came liqueurs, perhaps brandy, perhaps chartreuse, small glasses of liquid fire meant to warm the chest and slow the night to a dignified close. This was the final act of the evening's performance. Guests leaned back fully now. Waistcoats loosened ever so slightly. Gowns settled into silk-lined chairs. The intensity of earlier courses had given way to a quiet satisfaction. Coffee was not just a drink. It was a signal. The feast had succeeded. The standards of first class had been upheld. Some diners might have excused themselves to the smoking room, where cigars would glow and conversations would turn deeper. Politics, investments, speculation about American industry. Others would stroll the grand staircase, admiring its sweeping ironwork and glass dome. The Titanic, at this moment, felt invincible. Electric lights hummed gently. The engines vibrated with steady rhythm. The night seemed peaceful, obedient even. For the elite aboard, this was civilization perfected. Steel and steam harnessed to comfort. Coffee cups clinked softly onto saucers. A final sip of brandy burned pleasantly down the throat. Laughter drifted across the dining saloon. Someone might have glanced at the clock, noting the late hour with mild surprise, but no alarm. Above deck, the air had grown bitterly cold. Breath turned instantly to vapor. The sea remained eerily smooth. Ice warnings had been received earlier in the day, messages from other ships reporting drifting bergs and dangerous fields. Yet speed had not been reduced significantly. Inside, the last glow of indulgence lingered. Warmth, light, music. The kind of comfort that convinces the mind that danger belongs to another world. Coffee, in many cultures, signals alertness. But on this night, it marked the opposite. A deepening calm. A collective exhale after excess. Chairs scraped softly as guests rose. Goodnights exchanged. Plans for the next day in New York casually mentioned. No one in the dining saloon suspected that the final course had ended at precisely the moment history shifted. Moments later, high above in the crow's nest, a bell would ring. And the illusion, so carefully plated over 11 courses, would shatter against ice. When history remembers the Mongol Empire, it remembers speed, horses, arrows, the thunder of hooves rolling across the steppe, and at the center of it all stands one towering figure, Genghis Khan. But empires are not sustained by conquest alone. Behind the campaigns, beyond the battlefields, there existed a quieter, more strategic force, his daughters. Born to his chief wife, Berta, these women were not ornamental princesses waiting in felt tents for suitors. They were political instruments, territorial anchors, and ultimately rulers in their own right. The Mongol Empire did not simply conquer lands, it absorbed them, and absorption required governance. As Mongol armies swept across northern China, Central Asia, and beyond, defeated rulers were not always replaced by Mongol generals. Instead, something far more effective happened. Genghis Khan married his daughters into the ruling families of conquered territories, to princes, khans, and powerful tribal leaders. On the surface, these were diplomatic marriages. In reality, they were strategic takeovers. The arrangement was simple, but brilliant. A daughter of the great Khan married a local ruler. The territory retained its familiar leadership structure, avoiding rebellion. But the ruler now answered to the Mongol imperial family through his wife. bloodlines intertwined. Loyalty was enforced not by occupation alone, but by kinship. And when those husbands died, sometimes in battle, sometimes under circumstances history records with raised eyebrows, these women did not retreat. They ruled. The Mongol world was not like many settled empires of the time. Women rode horses, they managed camps, they supervised trade caravans. Steppe culture, though patriarchal, valued capability over ceremony. Authority was earned and recognized. Genghis Khan understood this better than anyone. By placing his daughters across the empire's frontiers, he created a network of loyal governors bound to him not just by law, but by blood. These daughters commanded armies, collected tribute, maintained order, and protected trade routes stretching across Asia. They were not shadows behind thrones, they were the thrones. And in many ways, the Mongol Empire did not merely expand through conquest, it stabilized through daughters. Among the most formidable of these imperial daughters was Alakai Beki. She was married into the Ongud tribe, a powerful Turkic people who controlled crucial territory along the northern frontier of China. This was not a random placement. The Ongud lands bordered the Jin dynasty's remaining strongholds, and later became vital in securing Mongol dominance over northern China. Whoever ruled there stood at the edge of empire and resistance alike. Alakai's marriage bound the Ongud directly to the Mongol imperial house. Her husband, a tribal ruler, formally accepted Mongol supremacy. But this was more than ceremonial loyalty. The Ongud became protectors of key passes, guardians of trade routes, and enforcers of Mongol authority in the region. Then came the turning point. When her husband died, Alakai did not fade into obscurity. She assumed authority. Sources indicate she governed the Ongud lands directly, maintaining stability and loyalty to her father's empire. That alone was extraordinary in a 13th century world where women in many societies were sidelined from political power. But on the steppe, practicality overruled convention. Alakai commanded not just a court, but soldiers. She managed tribute, secured borders, and ensured that the flow of communication between Mongolia and China remained uninterrupted. Her territory functioned as a strategic bridge between nomadic and sedentary worlds. More importantly, she remained fiercely loyal to her father's vision. When Genghis Khan campaigned against the Tangut state of Western Xia, the Ongud forces supported Mongol operations. The frontier held firm under her watch. In an empire expanding at astonishing speed, that kind of stability was invaluable. Alakai represents something historians often overlook, the administrative genius behind Mongol conquest. While her brothers rode into legend through battlefield exploits, she secured territory through governance. Her power was not symbolic, it was structural. Without frontier stability, campaigns falter. Without trusted governors, conquered lands revolt. Alakai ensured neither happened under her jurisdiction. She was not merely married into power, she wielded it. And through her, the northern edge of the Mongol Empire remained secure, not by constant war, but by disciplined control. The empire expanded outward, but it endured because daughters like Alakai held it steady. If Alakai guarded the northern frontier, Chechaigan stood at another critical edge of empire, the west. Chechaigan was married into the Oirat Confederation, a powerful tribal group inhabiting regions of western Mongolia and parts of what is now Central Asia. The Oirats were no minor tribe. They controlled vast grazing lands and commanded mobile warriors who could either become dangerous enemies or indispensable allies. Genghis Khan chose alliance. By marrying Chechaigan into the Oirat ruling house, he bound a potentially rival power directly to the imperial family. Once again, this was not romance, it was statecraft. Blood ties forged loyalty far more effectively than temporary treaties. But as with her sister, marriage was only the beginning of Chechaigan's influence. The Mongol Empire was expanding rapidly during her lifetime, pushing into Central Asia, Persia, and beyond. Western territories were diverse, linguistically, culturally, religiously. Holding them together required more than brute force. It required negotiation, understanding tribal dynamics, and maintaining delicate balances of power. Chechaigan appears in historical accounts as a figure of authority within Oirat lands. When leadership shifts occurred, whether through death, succession struggles, or political realignment, she maintained Mongol alignment. The Oirats did not rebel. They integrated. Her influence helped ensure that Western Mongol territories did not fracture during the early, volatile years of expansion. Stability in the West allowed Mongol armies to push deeper into Khwarezm and further into Central Asia without fearing collapse behind them. Steppe politics were never simple. Alliances could shift quickly. Loyalties could fracture under pressure. But a daughter of Genghis Khan ruling from within a tribal power base carried immense weight. Her lineage alone commanded respect. Chechaigan's authority reinforced a key truth about the Mongol Empire. It was not only a war machine. It was a network of familial governance. Through her, the Western steppe remained bound to the imperial center. Her rule was not dramatic, like a cavalry charge. It was quieter. But without that quiet control, the empire's western flank might have splintered. Instead, it held. And in holding, it allowed the Mongol world to stretch further than any steppe confederation before it. If Alakai secured the north and Chechaigan stabilized the west, then Tumenlun embodied something even more striking. The Mongol widow who did not disappear. Tumenlun was married into a powerful Central Asian ruling family during the height of Mongol expansion. Like her sisters, she was placed strategically, embedded within a conquered or allied territory to ensure loyalty to the imperial center. Her marriage tied local elites directly to the bloodline of Genghis Khan. Then her husband died. In many contemporary societies, widowhood meant political erasure. Authority passed to male heirs or rival claimants. Women were often sidelined, their role reduced to ceremonial presence or family negotiation. But the Mongol world functioned differently. When Tumenlun's husband died, and sources hint that several of these imperial sons-in-law met untimely ends, she assumed control, not as a placeholder, not as a temporary regent, but as a governing authority in her own right. The Mongols practiced a form of levirate marriage, where widows might marry a relative of their deceased husband to maintain alliances. But in cases involving the Great Khan's daughters, power did not automatically transfer away from them. Their bloodline elevated them above competing local elites. Tumenlun governed territory that stretched across key trade routes linking Mongolia to Central Asia. These routes were the arteries of the empire, carrying silk, horses, precious metals, and intelligence. Control of them meant influence over both wealth and communication. And she controlled them. Her authority ensured that tribute flowed properly, that rebellions were suppressed swiftly, and that Mongol administrative systems took root in newly absorbed lands. While Mongol generals led campaigns abroad, figures like Tumenlun secured the rear. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore. These daughters were not passive diplomatic tokens. They were placed in volatile regions and entrusted with real power. When male rulers died, whether by warfare, illness, or intrigue, governance did not collapse. It transitioned to them. Tumenlun's rule highlights one of the most underappreciated strengths of the Mongol Empire: adaptive leadership. Authority followed capability and lineage, not rigid gender exclusion. She did not command through spectacle. She governed through structure. And through her steady rule, another vast piece of the Mongol world remained intact, bound not just by conquest, but by daughters who knew how to hold it together. By now, a pattern is impossible to ignore. Genghis Khan did not merely conquer territory, he distributed it through his daughters. Marriage was his most sophisticated weapon. Every alliance created a political anchor. Every wedding feast secured another frontier. But what makes this story darker and more fascinating is what often followed those marriages. Husbands died, sometimes in battle, which in the 13th century was hardly unusual. Mongol expansion was relentless, and sons-in-law were expected to fight alongside imperial forces. But in several cases, these deaths occurred conveniently, clearing the path for Genghis Khan's daughters to assume authority. Were these accidents of war? Perhaps. Or perhaps the great Khan understood something fundamental about power. That blood loyalty is stronger than marital loyalty. A son-in-law might hesitate. A daughter would not. When a husband died, succession could have become chaotic. Local nobles might challenge Mongol authority. Rival claimants might fracture alliances. But instead, stability often followed, because the widow ruled, and she ruled as a daughter of the imperial house. The Mongol Empire was unique among many medieval states in its flexibility. Women on the steppe were accustomed to managing camps, livestock and trade, while men were away campaigning. They understood logistics. They commanded respect. Authority was not foreign to them. So when imperial daughters stepped into governance, they did not enter unprepared. They commanded troops. They supervised tax collection and tribute. They protected the vast relay networks that later became the Yam postal system. They ensured that conquered populations remained compliant. In effect, Genghis Khan created a web of female governors across Asia, stretching from Mongolia to northern China and deep into Central Asia. These women acted as stabilizers. They were both insiders and outsiders, married into local power structures but permanently loyal to the imperial center. This arrangement produced something remarkable. While Mongol armies moved ever outward, the territories behind them did not collapse into rebellion. The empire expanded without constantly disintegrating at its edges. And at the center of that stability were women whose authority came not from swords, but from bloodline and competence. Marriage was the entry point. Widowhood was the moment of transformation. And governance, steady, disciplined, strategic governance, was the true inheritance of the daughters of the steppe. To understand how these women ruled so effectively, you have to understand the world that shaped them. The Mongol steppe was not a place for ornamental nobility. Survival demanded competence. Camps had to move with the seasons. Herds had to be managed across vast grasslands. Trade caravans had to be negotiated and protected. When men rode off to war, life did not pause. Women ran the empire at home. Berta herself had already set the precedent. Abducted in her youth and later rescued by Genghis Khan, she became far more than a chief wife. She influenced succession, commanded respect among tribal leaders, and helped consolidate Temujin's early alliances. Her daughters grew up watching power exercised by a woman at the very center of political life. On the steppe, women rode horses. They hunted. They managed wealth in the form of livestock. They supervised domestic economies that were anything but small. A Mongol encampment was a mobile state, and its chief women operated like ministers of logistics. This cultural foundation made something possible that would have been unthinkable in many sedentary societies. When Alakai, Chichagan, and Tumenlun assumed authority, they were not defying tradition. They were extending it. The Mongol understanding of power was fluid. Authority followed lineage and capability, not rigid ceremony. A daughter of the Great Khan carried legitimacy equal to that of many male rulers in allied territories. Her command over troops and tribute was not symbolic, it was practical. Even foreign observers were struck by the influence of Mongol women. Persian chroniclers and Chinese officials noted their visible role in politics. They negotiated, they issued orders, they influenced military decisions. This does not mean the Mongol world was modern in any contemporary sense. It remained patriarchal, martial, hierarchical. But within that structure, elite women operated with astonishing reach. And that reach mattered. As the empire stretched across continents, its survival depended on steady hands behind the lines. Campaigns could be glorious, conquest could be swift, but governance required continuity. The daughters of Genghis Khan provided that continuity. They were raised in a culture that demanded resilience. They inherited a political tradition that valued strength. And when power shifted toward them, they did not hesitate. They ruled because the steppe had already taught them how. By the time the Mongol Empire reached from the Pacific coast to the edges of Eastern Europe, it was no longer just a war machine. It was a system. And systems do not survive on cavalry charges alone. The daughters of Genghis Khan formed part of what we might call the empire's silent architecture, the framework that held together territories too vast to manage through fear alone. While generals advanced outward, these women ensured that the interior did not fracture. Think about the scale. Messages had to travel thousands of miles. Tribute had to be collected from farmers, merchants, and nomads alike. Trade routes linking China to Central Asia had to remain secure. Local elites needed to feel watched, but not crushed. The Mongols eventually formalized this connectivity through the Yam relay system, a network of horse stations stretching across Asia. But even before it reached its full sophistication, stability at regional levels was essential. That stability rested in trusted hands. Alakai on the northern frontier, Chechayagan in the west, Tumenlun along key Central Asian corridors. Each governed territory that functioned like a hinge between the imperial center and the outer world. These women did not merely represent Mongol authority, they embodied it. Their bloodline gave them legitimacy. Their upbringing gave them administrative competence. Their loyalty ensured alignment with the Great Khan's objectives. And perhaps most importantly, they created predictability. Conquered populations could revolt against distant generals, but a ruler embedded within local political culture, yet tied directly to the imperial family, created a bridge rather than a wall. It reduced friction, it softened transitions. This model proved powerful during succession crises as well. After the death of Genghis Khan, the empire did not immediately disintegrate. That continuity owed much to the web of familial governance already in place. The daughters had secured their territories not just militarily, but structurally. Their rule reveals something crucial about Mongol statecraft. Conquest was only phase 1. Integration was phase 2. And integration required more than strength. It required intelligence, adaptability, and loyalty. The daughters of the steppe provided all three. They did not ride into legend with flaming arrows, but without them, the legend would have collapsed long before it reached its farthest horizon. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the empire did not shatter overnight. That alone is extraordinary. History is full of empires that explode outward under a charismatic founder, only to collapse the moment that founder is gone. Succession wars, rival claimants, fractured alliances, the usual pattern of imperial decay. But the Mongol world held. Part of that resilience lay in the system Genghis Khan had already constructed. A network of sons commanding armies, yes, but also daughters governing strategically placed territories. Power was not concentrated in a single city or court. It was distributed across a vast familial web, and those daughters were still there. Alakai continued to oversee the northern frontier. Chichaigan's Oirat alliances remained intact. Tumenlun maintained control over trade arteries linking Mongolia to Central Asia. Their authority did not evaporate with their father's death. In fact, it became even more critical. The empire transitioned to the rule of Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's son. While he directed campaigns westward into Eastern Europe and southward into China, the internal structure had to remain stable. Rebellions could not flare up. Tributary systems could not falter. The daughters' territories functioned as stabilizing pillars during this delicate period. Succession politics within the imperial family were never simple. Rival branches competed for influence. Future Khans would emerge from different lines. Yet the governance established by Genghis Khan's daughters ensured that key regions did not drift into chaos while elites debated authority. Their presence also reinforced the idea that imperial legitimacy flowed through bloodline, not just through male heirs. The daughters represented continuity from the founder himself. In frontier zones especially, that symbolic link mattered. And yet, as the empire expanded further west and south, the visibility of these women in historical sources gradually diminished. Chroniclers, often male and writing from settled societies, focused more on generals and khans than on female administrators. But absence in the record does not equal absence in power. The early Mongol Empire survived its founder because its structure was layered. Military force at the front, familial governance behind. The daughters were part of that second layer. They had been positioned not for spectacle, but for endurance. And when the empire faced its first true test without Genghis Khan, that endurance held. History remembers conquerors easily. It remembers the thunder of hooves, the cities that fell, the borders redrawn in blood. The name Genghis Khan echoes across textbooks and documentaries alike. But empires are not maintained by thunder alone. The daughters of the great Khan, Alakai, Chechaigan, Tumenlun, and others whose names flicker faintly in surviving records, governed territories that formed the connective tissue of the Mongol world. They held together trade routes that would later become part of the Silk Road revival under Mongol protection. They ensured tribute continued to flow. They suppressed unrest, not just with force, but with embedded authority. And yet, they are rarely centered in the narrative. Why? Partly because chroniclers were often outsiders, Persian, Chinese, European, whose cultural frameworks did not fully grasp steppe traditions of female authority. Partly because warfare creates louder stories than governance. Battles are dramatic. Administration is quiet. But quiet does not mean insignificant. The Mongol Empire became the largest contiguous land empire in history, not simply because it conquered quickly, but because it consolidated effectively. The web of daughters placed strategically across Asia functioned like stabilizing anchors. Each marriage was a calculated insertion of imperial blood into regional politics. Each widow who assumed rule strengthened that insertion. Their power was not decorative. It was operational. They commanded troops when necessary. They oversaw economic systems. They represented the living extension of the imperial founder. In volatile frontier regions, that combination of lineage and competence was decisive. In many ways, they prefigured later Mongol women who would rule even more visibly. Figures like Turagena Khatun and Sorghag Tani Beki, who shaped succession politics at the highest level. The foundation had already been laid. The daughters of Berta were not anomalies. They were prototypes. Their legacy challenges a common assumption about medieval power, that it was exclusively male. On the steppe, authority flowed through capability and bloodline, not rigid exclusion. The empire expanded because men conquered. It endured because women governed. And though their names do not dominate monuments or epics, the daughters of the steppe were queens in everything but title, architects of stability in a world built on motion. The Roaring Twenties did not begin with champagne. They began with silence. In November 1918, the First World War ended. The cannons stopped, trenches emptied. Soldiers returned home, carrying memories they could not easily explain. Europe was fractured. Monarchies had fallen. Old certainties about honor, hierarchy, and destiny had been shaken to their core. And when something old collapses, something new rushes in. The early 1920s felt like the world taking a deep breath after nearly suffocating. In the United States especially, the atmosphere shifted almost overnight. Factories that had churned out weapons retooled for consumer goods. Assembly lines that had been refined during wartime, perfected by men like Henry Ford, now produced automobiles at unprecedented speed. Cars became affordable. Roads stretched farther. Cities expanded outward. Motion became a way of life. But the real transformation was psychological. The war had exposed how fragile life could be. Millions had died for causes that many struggled to define. The old Victorian restraint, the stiff collars, the rigid codes of conduct, suddenly felt hollow. A generation that had witnessed mechanized slaughter was not interested in polite restraint. They wanted music. They wanted color. They wanted excess. The 1920s would become a decade of acceleration, financially, culturally, socially. Skyscrapers began rising higher. Radios entered living rooms, connecting households to voices and music from distant cities. Electricity illuminated nightlife in ways previous generations could barely imagine. The mood was not cautious, it was electric. There was a growing belief that progress was unstoppable, that technology had mastered distance, that prosperity would only expand. Wall Street surged, credit became easier to obtain, consumer culture blossomed. In many ways, the decade mirrored the illusion of the Titanic years earlier, confidence towering over caution, a sense that humanity had conquered uncertainty. But unlike the Titanic, this was not confined to a dining room at sea. This was a global shift. The war had ended one world. The Roaring Twenties would build another, louder, brighter, and determined never to whisper again. If the war created the vacuum, jazz filled it. The sound did not drift politely into American culture. It exploded. Trumpets blared, pianos pounded, drums snapped like gunfire transformed into rhythm. The music felt alive, improvisational, rebellious, unpredictable. At the center of this transformation stood figures like Louis Armstrong, whose trumpet could bend notes in ways that seemed almost defiant. Jazz was not merely entertainment, it was freedom translated into sound. The Great Migration had brought thousands of African Americans from the rural South to northern cities like Chicago and New York. With them came blues traditions, spirituals, and new forms of expression. In neighborhoods like Harlem, culture ignited. The Harlem Renaissance flourished. Writers, artists, and musicians redefining American identity. Nightclubs multiplied. Places like the Cotton Club became legendary. Inside, tuxedos and flapper dresses shimmered beneath dim lights. On stage, black musicians played for mostly white audiences, reflecting both cultural exchange and deep contradictions of segregation. jazz became the soundtrack of the decade's defiance. Its structure, or lack of it, mirrored the mood of the times. Improvisation replaced strict formality. Syncopation replaced predictable rhythm. The old rules were being rewritten in real time. Young people embraced it first. Parents disapproved. That tension only amplified its appeal. Dancing changed too. The Charleston, the Lindy Hop. Energetic, loose, scandalous by older standards. Couples moved with a freedom that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The body, once restrained by corsets and rigid posture, now swung and spun. Radio amplified everything. For the first time, music traveled instantly into homes across the country. What began in New Orleans could be heard in Kansas within days. Jazz was no longer regional, it was national. And with it came a new rhythm of life, faster, louder, more daring. The Roaring Twenties did not whisper. It played in brass and syncopation. And once the music started, there was no going back to silence. Here is one of the great ironies of the Roaring Twenties. Alcohol was illegal. In 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect, launching the era known as Prohibition. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages were banned across the United States. On paper, the nation had chosen sobriety. In reality, it chose rebellion. Instead of quiet taverns, the country produced hidden bars known as speakeasies, unmarked doors, secret passwords, dimly lit basements behind legitimate storefronts. Inside, the music played louder than ever and the drinks flowed freely. Bootleggers thrived. Men like Al Capone built criminal empires supplying illegal liquor to thirsty cities. Organized crime grew more powerful, more violent, and more profitable than lawmakers had imagined. The attempt to enforce morality had unintentionally fueled corruption. And yet, the glamour persisted. Champagne towers became symbols of excess, glasses stacked into shimmering pyramids, while sparkling wine cascaded from the top. The image perfectly captured the decade's attitude: abundance, spectacle, defiance. Women entered this nightlife in unprecedented numbers. Flappers, young women with bobbed hair, shorter skirts, and unapologetic confidence, smoked cigarettes in public, drank cocktails, and danced until dawn. They rejected the rigid codes of their mother's generation. Independence was fashionable. The speakeasy became a social equalizer of sorts. Wealthy financiers and struggling artists might share the same smoky room. Jazz bands performed inches from crowded tables. The air smelled of perfume, tobacco, and danger. Law enforcement often looked the other way. Bribes were common. Raids were theatrical. The illusion of control barely held. Prohibition was meant to impose discipline. Instead, it sharpened appetite. The illegality made indulgence more thrilling. Every sip felt like an act of resistance. Every party carried a faint undertone of risk. The Roaring Twenties thrived on that tension. On the surface, the nation was sober. Underground, it was intoxicated. And like champagne bubbling in a fragile glass, the energy of the decade rose higher and higher, bright, effervescent, and unaware of how quickly it could spill over. If jazz was the soundtrack of the Roaring Twenties, the flapper was its silhouette. She appeared almost suddenly, hair cut into a sharp bob, skirts rising to the knee, stockings rolled down, lipstick bold and unapologetic. She smoked in public. She drove cars. She danced until dawn. She did not ask permission. For a generation raised in Victorian restraint, this was nothing short of scandalous. The flapper represented a cultural shift born from war and modernity. Women had entered factories during the First World War, proving their economic capability. In 1920, American women gained the right to vote. The political landscape shifted. Independence was no longer theoretical. Fashion reflected this change. Corsets disappeared, silhouettes loosened, movement replaced rigidity. Designers like Coco Chanel popularized simpler, more practical styles that emphasized freedom rather than formality. Clothing became a declaration. Women would not return quietly to old constraints. Dance floors became battlegrounds of generational tension. The Charleston, with its kicks and spins, felt rebellious. Older observers called it indecent. Younger dancers called it exhilarating. Jazz clubs pulsed with motion as flappers embraced rhythm without restraint. But beneath the glamour lay deeper currents. The flapper challenged more than hemlines. She questioned expectations about marriage, work, and sexuality. She symbolized urban modernity, a break from rural tradition and inherited morality. Of course, not every woman lived this lifestyle. The image was amplified by magazines, films, and advertisements. Hollywood stars helped define the aesthetic, and cinema projected it nationwide. The ideal of the carefree, confident modern woman became aspirational. Yet the revolution was real. Women entered offices as secretaries, journalists, and sales clerks. They pursued higher education in greater numbers. They navigated cities independently. The Roaring Twenties did not just change music or nightlife. It changed identity. The flapper stood at the center of that transformation, equal parts symbol and participant. She laughed loudly. She drank defiantly. She cut her hair in expectations at the same time, and like the decade itself, she burned bright, thrilling, controversial, and impossible to ignore. While jazz filled nightclubs and champagne flowed in hidden rooms, another kind of music echoed through American cities, the clatter of stock tickers. The Roaring Twenties were not only about culture, they were about capital. Wall Street surged with unprecedented optimism. Investors believed the market could only rise. New technologies, automobiles, radios, household appliances created booming industries. The future seemed measurable in profits. At the center of this financial fever stood the New York Stock Exchange, where fortunes were made in hours. Ordinary citizens, not just wealthy industrialists, began buying shares. Credit was easy. Brokers allowed people to purchase stocks on margin, paying only a fraction up front and borrowing the rest. It felt like everyone could become rich. Skyscrapers rose as physical monuments to this confidence. Steel and glass stretched toward the clouds. Projects like the Chrysler Building would soon define the skyline. Architecture mirrored ambition. Taller, faster, brighter. Cities transformed. Electric signs lit up streets. Department stores displayed new consumer goods. Advertising became an industry in its own right, persuading Americans that happiness could be purchased in installments. Installment plans allowed families to buy radios and refrigerators without paying in full. The culture of consumption deepened. Owning things became a marker of modern life. Cars symbolized independence. Radios symbolized connection. Appliances symbolized progress. Yet beneath the glittering surface, the system was fragile. Much of the stock market's growth was speculative. Companies were overvalued. Investors borrowed heavily, assuming prices would never fall. Confidence fed on itself, detached from economic fundamentals. But in the moment, doubt was unfashionable. Financial magazines promised endless prosperity. Politicians praised the new era of business efficiency. The idea of permanent growth seemed plausible. The Roaring Twenties did not just roar in dance halls, they roared in boardrooms. The Champagne Towers had their counterpart in rising stock charts, both shimmering, both precariously balanced, and like champagne poured too quickly into fragile glass, the market's ascent depended on constant pressure. It sparkled, it dazzled, and it climbed higher and higher, reflecting a decade convinced that gravity had finally been conquered. While Wall Street climbed and jazz clubs pulsed, another revolution flickered to life in darkened theaters: Hollywood. The 1920s transformed motion pictures from novelty into cultural domination. What had begun as silent reels accompanied by piano music became a mass industry shaping fashion, speech, and aspiration across continents. Studios like Warner Brothers and Paramount Pictures built production empires in Southern California, where sunlight and open land made filmmaking efficient and profitable. Actors were no longer anonymous performers. They became stars. Audiences did not just watch them, they worshipped them. Figures like Charlie Chaplin captivated viewers worldwide with expressive gestures and comedic brilliance. Silent film demanded exaggerated emotion, faces that could communicate without dialogue. It was universal, no translation required. Then, near the end of the decade, everything changed. In 1927, the jazz singer introduced synchronized sound to mainstream audiences. Suddenly, actors could speak, sing. Theaters buzzed with astonishment. The silent era, almost overnight, felt outdated. The Roaring Twenties had found its voice. Hollywood amplified the decade's glamour. Films depicted lavish parties, fast cars, and fashionable women with bobbed hair and fearless smiles. Cinema became both mirror and magnifier of reality. It reflected excess and encouraged it. Movie palaces themselves were temples of indulgence, ornate interiors, velvet seats, chandeliers glowing overhead. Watching a film was not a casual act. It was an event. The silver screen shaped ideals. It defined beauty standards, romantic expectations, and even social behavior. Young viewers copied hairstyles and clothing seen in films. Language and slang spread through dialogue once sound arrived. Hollywood also exported the Roaring Twenties abroad. Europe, still recovering from war, consumed American films that projected prosperity and vitality. The United States became not just an economic force, but a cultural one. Dreams flickered in black and white light. But like the stock market, the film industry's rapid expansion depended on continued optimism and spending. The lights dimmed, the projector whirred, and for 90 minutes at a time, audiences believed the party would never end. By the middle of the decade, the Roaring Twenties had perfected its own mythology. Mansions glittered along Long Island's North Shore. Champagne flowed from crystal towers. Jazz drifted across manicured lawns. Guests arrived in gleaming automobiles, dressed in silk and confidence. This world would later be immortalized by F. Scott Fitzgerald in his novel, The Great Gatsby, a story that captured the glamour and the emptiness simmering beneath it. The decade celebrated wealth as spectacle. Old money families clung to tradition and pedigree. New money entrepreneurs flaunted success with unapologetic extravagance. The distinction mattered socially, but in both cases, the performance of prosperity was essential. Lavish parties became cultural theatre. Live bands played until dawn. Women in beaded dresses danced beneath chandeliers. Cigarette smoke curled toward painted ceilings. Laughter rang out, loud and reckless. But underneath the laughter, something fragile lingered. The prosperity of the era was uneven. Farmers struggled even as urban investors thrived. Industrial efficiency reduced labor needs, leaving some communities behind. Racial tensions simmered beneath the surface, even as jazz flourished in Harlem. The illusion of universal prosperity masked deep divisions. Fitzgerald understood this tension. His fictional Jay Gatsby built an empire on ambition and reinvention, throwing parties so extravagant they seemed endless. Yet behind the champagne and orchestras lay longing for status, for validation, for a past that could not be recreated. The Roaring Twenties excelled at surfaces. Fashion sparkled, skylines climbed, music soared, but surfaces require support. The stock market's climb, the expansion of credit, the culture of excess, all depended on confidence. Confidence in endless growth, confidence in technological progress, confidence that the system itself was stable. Like the Titanic's dining room years earlier, the environment felt unsinkable. Guests raised glasses without questioning the foundation beneath their feet. The decade roared because it believed it could, because it assumed the music would not stop. But illusions, however dazzling, are still illusions. And even as Gatsby's parties glittered in fiction and real life alike, economic currents were already shifting beneath the dance floor. The champagne still sparkled, but the glass was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Every era of excess eventually meets a moment of reckoning. For the Roaring Twenties, that moment came in October 1929. For years, the stock market had climbed with relentless confidence. Investors borrowed heavily to buy shares, convinced prices would continue rising forever. Newspapers celebrated new highs. Brokers reassured nervous clients. The party felt unstoppable. Then the selling began. At first it seemed manageable, a correction perhaps, but panic spreads faster than optimism. As prices fell, investors rushed to sell. Margin calls demanded repayment of borrowed money. Fear replaced euphoria in a matter of hours. On October 29th, later known as Black Tuesday, the market collapsed in historic fashion. Ticker tapes ran hours behind actual trading because volume was so overwhelming. Fortunes evaporated not over years, but in days. The Roaring Twenties did not end with a whisper. They ended with a crash. The same stock exchange that had symbolized boundless possibility now became a symbol of fragility. Confidence, once unshakable, proved alarmingly delicate. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment surged. The contrast was brutal. Only months earlier, champagne towers had shimmered at rooftop parties. Jazz had pulsed through packed nightclubs. Automobiles had rolled confidently down newly paved roads. Now bread lines formed in cities that had boasted skyscrapers. The illusion of permanent prosperity shattered. This was not merely a financial event, it was psychological. A generation that had rejected caution and embraced speed suddenly confronted stillness. Credit tightened, consumption slowed. The optimism that defined the decade evaporated almost overnight. The crash did not immediately create the Great Depression, but it ignited the chain reaction that followed. The interconnected system, banks, investors, businesses, revealed its vulnerabilities. Looking back, the parallels to earlier overconfidence are hard to ignore. Like the Titanic's faith in engineering, the 20s' faith in markets had felt absolute. Technology and growth seemed to guarantee security. But systems built on relentless expansion are inherently unstable. The music stopped. The lights dimmed. And the Roaring Twenties, so loud, so glittering, so certain of itself, gave way to silence once again. Excess had reached its peak. Gravity had returned. The Roaring Twenties are often remembered for their sparkle, jazz horns, flapper dresses, champagne cascading into crystal towers. But what makes the decade unforgettable is not just its glamour, it is the contrast. In less than 10 years, society moved from post-war exhaustion to euphoric excess, and then from euphoric excess to economic collapse. The arc was dramatic, almost theatrical. A generation determined to live loudly found itself suddenly confronting silence. Yet the 20s did not simply vanish with the crash. They left fingerprints everywhere. Jazz did not disappear. It evolved, influencing swing and later genres. Hollywood did not close its doors. It adapted to sound films and new storytelling forms. Women did not return entirely to pre-war roles. The cultural shifts of the flapper era, independence, mobility, visibility, could not be fully undone. Even the skyscrapers remained, steel monuments to a time that believed the sky was only a suggestion. The decade exposed something essential about modern society. Progress accelerates desire. Technology amplifies possibility. But confidence, when detached from caution, becomes combustible. In many ways, the 20s mirrored the Titanic's dining room years earlier. Glittering interiors, absolute belief in forward motion, a sense that humanity had mastered its environment. Both moments shimmered. Both moments felt unsinkable. And both revealed how fragile that certainty could be. But history does not move backward neatly. The Great Depression reshaped policy, economics, and social safety nets. Governments intervened in markets in ways previously unthinkable. The crash forced a reckoning that redefined modern capitalism. The Roaring Twenties, then, were not merely a decade of excess. They were a turning point. They showed how quickly optimism can inflate and how abruptly it can deflate. They demonstrated the power of culture to break from tradition. They revealed the tension between innovation and restraint. Most of all, they proved that prosperity without balance is temporary. The jazz may have softened, the champagne may have dried, but the lessons lingered. Because the 20s were not just about noise, they were about the cost of believing